You've written a terrific, you write many terrific articles, but you've got a terrific article out now about how China is essentially cheating or scamming the entire climate change, global warming myth. So there's many layers to this, but let's just kick off with what is at the heart of how China can pollute away till 2030 with no problems, and yet we're all rushing around. We won't even put lighting in parks to help women because we think that's going to increase our carbon footprint. How did China arrive at this position?
So China would make the case that they missed their industrial revolution. So in 2001, December 2001, they joined the World Trade Organization, and then they bestowed themselves with this title of developing nation. Right. And at the time, you could make the case that they were a developing nation. They're now the world's largest exporter. They've got a $14.4 trillion economy, and they're the second largest nation, I would argue, a developed nation. What constitutes a developed nation now? And being a member of the WTO means that the onus is on them to categorise themselves as not being a developing nation. Now, you might just think this is some kind of... They get to decide. and the WTO doesn't actually actively define what a developing nation is. So say if you're Donald Trump, who's been quite cranky about this issue, because this has implications for trade and tariffs and in the middle of a trade war, he goes, well, what actually constitutes a developing nation? And at what point do we stop giving China these additional privileges? And China just goes, well, we are. End of story. Right. And that's all they have to do. And that's why there's this growing tension between Donald Trump, the US, his trade... So
Donald Trump's tweeted about this. Let's just have a look at the tweet that he's got out there, where he says that the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is broken when the world's richest countries claim to be developing countries to avoid World Trade Organization rules and get special treatment. Classic Trump style, no more. Today, I directed the US trade representative to take action so that countries stop cheating the system at the expense of the USA. So they're cheating the system. How does this... So talk us through that and how it impacts onto climate change as well.
For the way that this ties in, it's quite extraordinary, really. So obviously, the Paris Agreement is signed a couple of years ago now, and 48 nations had to contribute considerable amounts of money, including Australia, which offered up $200 million to this big pool, which was governed by the World Bank. And it became the financial mechanism by which you implemented means of lowering emissions. China exempts itself because it's a developing nation and instead actually makes bids for the grants to use the money that countries like Australia, which have 1/10 of the economy, to reduce its own emissions. But this is even better. The Paris Agreement, which they signed, has given them unfettered room to grow between now and 2030. So their own government prediction is 13,000 megatons of CO2 today produced by China every year.
Right.
That's going to rise to 16,000 megatons of CO2.
Right. Okay.
A rise of 2,912, which is the equivalent of 5 Australian economies. The creation of 5 brand new Australias doing nothing to curb emissions. So, look, we've made the promise.
The increase.
That's simply the increase.
Increase from where they are. And they're already the world's greatest.
And over that 10 years, we are going to be look, there's debate over where we're going to meet our targets or not, but we as a nation have promised to reduce it by at least 24% from 2005 levels by 2030. So we have made an effort to commit to not increasing, whereas China has gone the other way, despite their massive economic portfolio and the fact they are the biggest exporter in the world. And the world just turns a blind eye. That, to me, what I find most irksome about this is when I see protests and rallies and you look at our particular carbon emissions data stream. We're talking about dollars and cents over a multi-billion-dollar portfolio.
Yeah.
This is a thing that doesn't make sense to me. If you were truly upset about this, then why aren't you calling for renegotiation of the Paris Agreement? And then I'm thinking, well, maybe it's not quite about that.
So when you said 200, we put in 200 million into the bucket, and how much did China take out?
260 million.
So our lot went straight to China.
Yeah.
So hang on. So we're sitting here. So the government's handing out hundreds of millions of dollars, and the Chinese are just saying, thank you, taking it, thank you very much, we'll have a bit of that.
Obviously, it goes into the general pool.
Goes into the pool and they help
10
themselves.
billion.
At the same time, they're emitting to Billy-O, like I said, so more and more emissions
the single largest emitter, double the United States. So, look, people are making the case that, well, there's a lot of people in China, so if you look at carbon per capita, That's fine. You can make very clever arguments to say that China is not really doing the bad thing. At the end of the day, if you take the IPCC report seriously, as these climate activists do, and if you listen to the recommendations, if you do not stop China from emitting between now and 2030, then, according to this report, we're all doomed, essentially.
We're all doomed anyway. So here's the So the equivalent is we're sitting there with a little thimble trying to empty the boat, you know, and there's some bloke with a huge bucket just tipping more and more water in. So by this argument, we are completely wasting our time with everything we are doing to reduce carbon emissions.
One of the... I don't think it's a particularly strong argument, but one of the stronger arguments is, well, we need to act like proper citizens in the world stage and be symbolic.
But why aren't the Chinese?
Do you think China is going to look at our symbolism of cutting back and say, you know what, we should do the right thing? No, what they're doing is they're going to grow their renewable sector as quick as humanly possible using taxpayer-funded grants, and they're going to transition the moment it is more equitable to do renewable energy than fossil fuels, which is the moment we should all essentially transition to be the most economically sound. But
there's no evidence that moment will ever arrive.
That it might happen, but that's why they're putting so much money into it. So they're not doing it for altruistic
reasons. But they still hit a peak in 2030, and that peak can be whatever they choose that peak to be, correct?
And in the Paris Agreement, they've actually got this hilarious statement where they say, well, in 2030, we'll look at considering cutting back, but only after we assess the economic situation, because, of course, China is a developing nation.
Fantastic. So they can pollute away all they like, all they want to hit whatever high. So you've estimated 16,000.
Well, they've estimated 16,000.
But they could go beyond that if they chose, couldn't they?
They could go beyond that, but the projections look like they're pretty accurate. They might even dip in just below that. But it's not just China. So there's actually a broader problem with the EU, and obviously this is where a lot of it started. The EU has made a promise to drop from a collective 4,317 megatons, which is what they emitted in 2017, to 3,390. So essentially, they need to drop 1,000 megatons, and they're stagnant. They've been stagnant for the last year. In fact, they actually went up by 0.6% in 2017. So if
they're going crazy.
They're championing it. So if you use France as the case study, France actually went up by dropped slightly by 1.1% between 2015 and today. They've made a promise to cut by 40%. So they're setting these very altruistically ambitious missions they're flexing on the world stage.
Look at us.
And then Australia, they say, well, Australia, why have you only picked 24%? Even though we're the closest to actually meeting our target. France, an actual report came out today, and I quote, this is from their own government, France's commitments are ambitious, but at the current rate, they are unlikely to be met. This was last month. Right now, France will not meet its commitments.
And we know why, and that is because the only mechanism the French have to meet their carbon emission cuts is a petrol tax, a diesel tax, because they're already nuclear. They're a large nuclear power. They use a lot of their electricity comes from nuclear or comes from other European countries. So the only mechanism they have is this diesel tax, and that diesel tax is now well into our third or fourth month of riots in the street. I don't know if you've seen any of those YouTube clips, but the riots are vicious. I mean, these are thuggish, whatever they're called, basically the hardcore police with the helmets and the batons are beating people senseless.
Burning cities down.
Burning cities because they cannot pay for their fuel tax, all of which is just complete insanity. When you look, as you've said, Jack, the Chinese are just completely playing the entire system, playing us for mugs. Jack, I think terrific work there. Keep up the good work. Keep exposing what's going on. Because seriously, Australia, you are being played for an absolute mug. We are being taken for a ride. Good on Donald Trump for calling it out. But seriously, when are our own politicians going to start realising that this is total insanity, where even the chief scientist says what we're doing is pointless?